Happy Monday. Let me just remind you, guys, if you are doing your work on paper, you have to send me a picture or you need to turn it in at school, but you have to get that work to me somehow or I have no way of grading it, okay? Remember, if you've been doing your work on paper, please send it to me some way. You can post it to the assignment. Actually, at this point, I'm going through and I'm grading things. If you wanted to email it to me, that might be the easiest way. That'll be kirkk@wcde.org. Or send me a message on Class Dojo. But I can't grade it if I don't have it. You've got to send it to me. Okay, so this video is going to be chapters 32 and 33. Chapter 32 is called Cascades of Pink Peaches. On August 22nd, Phil and Fred Garrett sat in Rokuroshi, wondering what was happening. They'd been told nothing of the war's end. All they knew was that the Japanese commander had been gone for 5 days, and the guards had been leading them on an ominous marches through the forest. That afternoon, the Japanese commander walked into the barracks. "The Emperor has brought peace to the world," he said. He surrendered his sword. That night, the POWs threw a party to end all parties. Demolishing the fence, they built a gigantic pile of wood. They got a barrel of rice wine. Drinking began. The bonfire was lit. An Alabaman transformed a huge can into a drum, and tipsy men began dancing. A conga line of crazy drunk POWs wrapped around the camp, and one man did a terrible striptease. The revelry was so riotous that one POW was surprised everyone survived the night. The following day, the hungover POWs walked down the mountain to find mostly ghost towns. The civilians had seen the bonfire and fled. The POWs hiked back up and waited for help to come. At Naoesu, the guards were suddenly fawning and submissive. Only the Japanese commander was defiant, haughtily refusing Fitzgerald's repeated demands for food for his starving men. Oh, there's a picture. It's labeled POWs Celebrate the War's End. Man. They look so happy, but they also look so thin. But can you imagine what that would feel like to have gone through something like that and then to be free? On the morning of August 26th, 6 days after the war's end was announced in Naoesu, American fighter planes arrived. The POWs charged outside yelling. They painted 2 giant words on the ground in white line: food and smokes. Messages dropped from the cockpits. The planes had been hauling emergency supplies to POW camps but had exhausted their loads. The pilots promised food would soon come. Unable to feed the POWs, the pilots did the next best thing, putting on an air show while the prisoners shouted and wept. The show had a persuasive effect on the Japanese commander. Japanese trucks soon arrived, and out came rations, biscuits, and canned fruit. That afternoon, more planes flew over, and as the POWs ran for their lives, bags began thumping down. Each man received half a tin of tangerines, 1 pack of biscuits, 2 cigarettes, and candy. Concerned that it wasn't nearly enough food, Fitzgerald had someone write 700 PWs here on the ground. Someone waded into the river to grab an errant bag and in it found magazines. The war, the magazine said, had ended on August 15th. The speaker Wade had heard on the guard's radio that day had been Emperor Hirohito. So for 5 days, 7 in the case of Rokuroshi, the Japanese had deceived the POWs to hide the fact that the war was over. The reason was almost certainly that they were awaiting instruction on whether to carry out the kill-all order. That's scary, isn't it? 3 days after the fighters flew over, the Americans sent in the big boys, 6 loaded B-29s. Giant pallets poured out, swinging under red, white, and blue parachutes. The first load hit the compound. Others fell into nearby rice paddies, pursued by hundreds of gleeful living skeletons. One canister bore a message written in chalk. Bombed here May 45. Sorry I missed. Boxes fell all over the landscape. Some civilians pulled them into their homes. Others, though in great hardship, dragged them into camp. Pallets banged down and broke open. Cascades of pink peaches spilled over the countryside. A crate exploded and the sky rained peas. Louie and Tinker just missed being totaled by a drum full of shoes that shot through the Benjo roof. To prevent disaster, someone ran onto the road and wrote, "Drop here." Food, medicine, and clothing fell in such abundance that Fitzgerald asked a man to check that whoever had written 700 PWs here hadn't accidentally added a zero. Eventually, someone climbed on a roof and wrote, "No more, thanks." And there's a picture. And you can see they wrote "enough, thanks," and "no more thanks." And then you can see prisoners of war. I can't read the number. I'd say PW was just on the barracks so they didn't get bombed in the first place. Shoo. It's a whole lot, isn't it? An orgy of eating commenced. Men crammed their stomachs full, then had seconds and thirds. Louis shoveled an entire can's worth of condensed soup into his mouth, too hungry to add water. 3 men drank 2 gallons of cocoa. At nightfall, the eating stopped. Men upended by swollen stomachs drifted off to sleep. Louis lay among them, swaddled in an American parachute. In its rampage over the East, Japan had brought atrocity and death on a scale that staggers the imagination. In the midst of it were prisoners of war. Japan held some 132,000 POWs from America, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Holland, and Australia. Of those, nearly 36,000 died, more than 1 in every 4. Japan also held more than 215,000 POWs from other nations, and untold thousands of forced laborers. Their death rates are unknown. Americans fared particularly badly. Of the 34,648 Americans held by Japan, 12,935, more than 37% died. By comparison, only 1% of Americans held by the Nazis and Italians died. Japan murdered thousands of POWs on death marches and worked thousands of others to death in slavery. Thousands of other POWs were beaten, burned, stabbed, or clubbed to death, shot, beheaded, murdered in medical experimentation, and eaten alive in ritual acts of cannibalism. What? And as a result of being fed grossly inadequate and befouled food and water, thousands more died of starvation and easily preventable diseases. Under the kill-all order, the Japanese massacred all 5,000 Korean captives on Tianan, all the POWs on Baleo, Wake, and Tarawa, and all but 11 POWs at Palawan. They were evidently about to murder all the other POWs and civilian internees in their custody when the atomic bomb brought their empire crashing down. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed its formal surrender. The Second World War was over. Okay, so I have a picture, and I'm just going to warn you, it's upsetting. The caption reads, "At a Japanese POW camp, this dead American was found near war's end, still standing, at a sink at which he was trying to drink. American soldiers and guerrillas went behind enemy lines to rescue the men at this camp, but they were too late. They found the bodies of 150 POWs starved to death." I mean, it's an awful picture. I mean, he's so thin that he doesn't even look real. It's terrible. For Louis, these were days of bliss. Though sick and weak, he glowed with euphoria. Days earlier, he would have killed the bird without remorse. Now, the vengeful urge no longer had sure footing. The bird was gone, and all Louis felt was rapture. He and the other POWs doled out supplies to civilians, stood in circles of Japanese children handing out chocolate, and brought food and clothing to the guards for their families. Gorging brought consequences. Bodies that had spent years scraping by on seaweed were overwhelmed. Naosu became a festival of rapid-fire diarrhea. The Benjo lines wound everywhere, and men unable to wait began dropping their pants and fertilizing Japan wherever the spirit moved them. Then they resumed feasting. All over Japan, more than 1,000 planes saturated POW camps with nearly saturated POW camps with nearly 4,500 tons of spam and fruit cocktail, soup, chocolate, medicine, and countless other treasures. I have another picture. This one is again hard to look at, but not as bad as the previous. This one says American POWs upon liberation from a Japanese prison camp. I mean, you look at this and you wonder how these guys survived. It's terrible. Let's see. At Omori, Bob Martindale was sitting in the bird's old office, savoring his freedom, when an enormous box sailed out of the sun, hit the ground, and exploded, obliterating the office in a cataclysm of American cocoa powder. Martindale stumbled out, caked head to toe in cocoa, but otherwise uninjured. Everyone in camp was eager to get home, but Fitzgerald received a radio message telling him to wait for an evacuation team to arrive on September 4th. So the POWs waited, eating, smoking, eating, celebrating, swimming, and eating more. Someone broke into a storehouse and discovered some 1,500 Red Cross boxes hidden by the Japanese while the POWs starved. Louis ate voraciously, got stronger, and expanded in all directions, his body bloating from water retention. September 4th arrived. The evacuation team never showed up. More than 2 weeks had passed since the men had learned the war was over, and Fitzgerald was sick of waiting. He walked to the train station and asked a Japanese official to arrange for a train to be there the next day. The official refused. Commander Fitzgerald had been in Japanese custody since April 1943. For 2.5 years, he'd been forced to grovel before sadists and imbeciles as he tried to protect his men. He'd been starved, beaten, waterboarded, and enslaved, and had had his fingernails torn out. He was done negotiating. He hauled back and punched the station official in the face. The next morning, the train was there, right on time. On September 5th, Louis stepped from the barracks for the last time. Outside, the POWs were congregating, holding what few possessions they had. The British Commonwealth soldiers held the boxes bearing the remains of the 60 Aussies who had died in the camp. Determined to leave this indecent place with dignity, the men assembled behind their nation's flags. Together they marched through the gate towards wives and sweethearts and mom and dad and home. Louis glanced back. The sickest POWs remained behind, awaiting transport the next day. Fitzgerald stayed with them, unwilling to leave until the last of his men was liberated. As he crossed over the bridge and Naosu passed out of view, Louis raised his arm and waved the war goodbye. As you may have guessed, it's Mother's Day as I'm recording this. And chapter 33 is Mother's Day. Which has got me worked up just as much as the previous, because I'm sure you can guess why this chapter is called Mother's Day. Think about how Louise Zamperini will feel. The Naosu POWs had control of the train. At each village, the train squealed to a stop and the men piled off, then piled back on, laden with wine. The men grew rowdier. A lieutenant told them to behave themselves. He didn't want any men falling overboard. His warning did no good. All afternoon, drunken POWs fell off the train. One of them was the lieutenant himself. Across Japan, as POW trains snaked toward Yokohama, the men saw what the B-29s had done. Once grand cities were now black stains. Seeing the destruction of the enemy that had enslaved and tormented them and murdered their friends, the POWs cheered. But after the first city, there was another, then another. City after city razed, survivors drifting like specters. The cheering died away. On Louis's train, the silence came at Tokyo. A week after Louis left Omori, 16 square miles of the city and tens of thousands of souls had been burned by B-29s. Some trains rolled past Hiroshima. The city was simply gone. Virtually every POW believed its destruction had saved them from execution. They were almost certainly right. As his train pulled into Yokohama, Tom Wade heard a woman's voice. "Welcome back, boys." Before me, in immaculate khaki uniform and cap, stood an American girl with a magazine cover smile, faultless makeup, and peroxide blonde hair, he wrote. After 3.5 years in prison camp, I had been liberated by the great American blonde. The POWs were blissfully enveloped in Red Cross nurses. To Ken Marvin, they all looked like goddesses. Someone spotted a mess hall and a stampede ensued. A journalist, Robert Trumbull, called out, asking if anyone had a good story. Tinker told him to talk to Louis Zamperini. "Zamperini's dead," said Trumbull. The POW Tinker pointed to didn't even look like the famous runner, but Trumbull was curious enough to stop him. He asked Louis to prove his identity. Louis retrieved his wallet. In it there were $8, the newspaper illustration that had gotten him and Phil beaten up, and a USC pass inscribed with Louis's name. Trumbull was astonished. He began asking questions, and as he scribbled notes, Louis told his story. When he finished, Trumbull asked him to reflect on his odyssey. Louis stood silent. "If I knew I had to go through those experiences again," he finally said, "I'd kill myself." The next morning, Louis was taken to an airfield to be flown to Okinawa. Finding a table stacked with K-rations, meal boxes for servicemen, he crammed several under his shirt, ignoring an attendant who tried to assure him that no one would starve him any more. Looking extremely pregnant, Louis boarded his plane. In the bustle, he'd been separated from his friends. There were no goodbyes. He was soon airborne, leaving Japan, he hoped, forever. Frank Rosniak, a staff sergeant for Louis' 11th Bomb Group, stood on the Okinawa airfield watching POWs arrive. He walked among them, marveling at how they savored the awful mess hall food, seeing them cry over photographs of wives of girlfriends who they hoped hadn't given them up for dead. Rosniak's commanding officer asked him to come to the debriefing of a POW from the 11th. When Rosniak arrived, he saw a battered POW sitting before officers who were staring at him in shock. The colonel said the man was Louis Zamperini, and he'd disappeared in 1943. Everyone in the bomb group had thought he was dead. Rosniak was incredulous. It was his job to write next of kin letters, and he'd probably written to Zamperini's mother, but he didn't remember. There'd been so many such letters. Not one of these men had turned up alive until now. Later, the dead man walked into the 11th Bomb Group's quarters, startling everyone. But it wasn't the reunion Louis anticipated. He knew almost no one. Many of his friends, he learned, were dead. Of the 16 young officers who shared his barracks on Oahu, only 4, Louis and Phil included, were still alive. I have a picture. It says Louis Wright and Fred Garrett a few weeks after war's end. Gorging nonstop after their camps were liberated, both men had gained weight precipitously. which is good. I imagine that when Louis goes back home, it would be much better for him to be back to a healthy weight. Because can you imagine how upsetting that would be to see a brother or a son or somebody you care about in that state? Be awful. Doctors examined Louis. After gorging for weeks, he weighed 143 pounds, but thanks to dramatic water retention, it was a doughy, moon-faced weight. He still had volatile diarrhea and was as weak as a blade of grass. He was only 28, but his body was etched with 27 months of abuse. The doctors, who knew what Louis had once been, gave him a solemn talk. After Louis left, a reporter asked about his running career. "It's finished," he said, his voice sharp. "I'll never run again." The Zamparinis were on edge. Louis's only message to reach home had been his radio broadcast 10 months earlier. The letters he'd written after the bird left Omori had still not arrived. The papers were full of stories about the Japanese murdering POWs, and the Zamparinis were scared. On the morning of September 9th, Pete was shaken awake by a hand on his shoulder. A friend was bending over him with a huge smile. Trumbull's story had appeared in the Los Angeles Times. Zamparini comes back from dead. Pete bolted for a telephone and called home. Sylvia picked up. Pete asked if she heard the news. "Did you hear the news?" she repeated to him. "Did I? Wow!" Pete asked to speak to his mother, but she was too overcome to talk. Louise and Virginia rushed to church to give thanks, then raced back to prepare for the homecoming. Dusting trophies in Louie's room, Louise blinked away tears, singing out, "He's on the way home! He's on the way home!" "From now on," she said, "September 9th is going to be Mother's Day to me. Because that's the day I learned for sure my boy was coming home." Liberation was a long time coming for Phil at Rokuroshi. After learning the war was over, the POW sat for 10 days, waiting for someone to come. Finally, a wondrous sight, B-29 skimming over, pallets hitting the rice paddies so hard the men had to dig them out. The POWs ate themselves silly, including one who devoured 20 pounds of food in one day. On September 9th, the Rokuroshi POWs were rescued. In Yokohama, a general broke down when he saw their condition. They were escorted aboard a ship for hot showers and pancakes. The ship set off for America. On October 16, 1945, Russell Allen Phillips stepped off a train in Indiana. There, standing where he'd left her 4 years earlier, was the woman whose love had sustained him. Ceci was in his arms at last. Four weeks later, in a wedding ceremony in Ceci's parents' house, the hero finally got the girl. Then, as he'd promised in a letter so long ago, Alan ran away with Ceci to a place where no one would find them. On Okinawa, Louis had a grand time, eating, drinking, and making merry. He discovered a delightful upside to being believed dead, scaring the hell out of people. Learning that a former track recruiter from USC was on the island, he asked a friend to tell the recruiter that he knew a college running prospect who could spin a mile in just over 4 minutes. The recruiter eagerly asked to meet the runner. When Louis appeared, the recruiter fell over backward in his chair. I have 2 pictures on this page. This one says, Russell Allen Phillips arrives at his mother's house. On the back of this photo, someone wrote, "Home!" And this one says, Louis prepares to board a flight home. He still looks super thin. Poor baby. On one of the series of flights that carried him home, Louis sat with the pilot, telling his story from the crash to Kwajalein to Japan. As he spoke, the pilot landed on an island, stopped the plane, and asked Louis if he knew where he was. Louis looked around at a charred wasteland. "This is Kwajalein," said the pilot. This couldn't be Kwajalein, Louis thought. When he was a captive, it was a swath of intense green. Now he couldn't see a single tree. The fight for this place had ripped the jungle off the island. Louis wondered if kind-hearted Kawamura had died here. There was, in fact, one tree still standing, and they went to see it. Staring at Kwajalein's last tree, with food in his belly, no one there to beat him, Louis felt as if he were in the sweetest of dreams. Pete was so anxious to see Louis that he could hardly bear it. When he learned Louis was finally stateside, admitted to San Francisco's Letterman General Hospital to recover from his ordeal, he went AWOL. AWOL is an abbreviation, and it essentially means, I'm trying to think if I know what the letters stand for, but it means that you have left your post in the military. He bummed a plane ride to San Francisco, hitchhiked to Letterman, and walked in. At the front desk, he called Louis's room. A minute later, Louis bounded into the lobby. Each was startled by the sight of the other. Expecting Louis to be emaciated, Pete was surprised to find him almost portly from water retention. Louis was disturbed by what years of worry had done to his brother Pete. Pete was gaunt, and he'd gone largely bald. The brothers fell together, eyes shining. And I have a picture. This one's labeled Louis and Pete Reunited. Pete and Louis spent several days together while doctors finally cured Louis of his diarrhea. After reading the Trumbull article, Pete had worried Louis might be severely traumatized, but his fears faded. Louis was upbeat and chatty. He seemed so well that when reporters came in to interview Louis, they crowded around Pete, assuming that of the two men, this haggard one had to be the POW. The Army sent a bomber to bring Louis home. The plane rose over the clouds into a shining blue morning. Scared of flying, Pete tried to distract himself by staring out over a carpet of bright clouds, the upside of a rainstorm. He felt as if he could step from the plane and walk on them. They sank into the rain and landed at Long Beach, where the rest of the family waited. The moment the plane stopped, Louis jumped down, ran to his sobbing mother, and folded himself around her. "Cara, mamma mia," he whispered, "my dear mother." It was a long time before they let go. And I have a picture, and it says Louis' Homecoming, Long Beach Airport, foreground left to right, Virginia, Sylvia, Louise, and Louis. And of course, that's Louis and his mom on the side there. Shoo. It's a happy emotional, but it makes me emotional, so I'm kind of glad this chapter is over. I don't know if I could have done much more. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.